Connection of Maine, and I have been in this industry for, oh gosh, almost 15 years now. And today we're going to be talking about legal situations. So you have your certification, but what does that mean if you're a gun owner, if you live in subsidized housing, if you have kids? So there are some things to consider. As we go through the session today, I think we'll probably take about an hour and a half. If you have questions, just throw them out there while we're going through things. Don't feel like you have to save them up until the end. You can use the chat feature up at the top to send a message that everyone can see, or one that only Ben, my colleague here, and I would be able to see. So once again, thank you so much, and let's just dive right on in. All right, we do need to start with a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. I have a lot of experience. I've done a lot of research. But I am not a lawyer, and what we're going to talk about here is not legal advice. So if you find yourself in a situation, some of this information might be helpful to you, but you should never, don't wing it. If you get yourself in a situation where you need a lawyer, please call a lawyer. All right. The laws that we're going to be talking about today change. Even here in the state of Maine, we have different laws from city to city. For example, Portland, where it's technically legal for a non-patient to possess and privately use medicine, versus up here where we are today in Gardner, that's a no-no still. So there are a lot of overlapping layers. The law is tricky, and so we're going to be talking about concepts today. But if you find yourself in a situation where you need a lawyer, definitely contact one. Okay. So we're going to talk about a little bit of some theoretical concepts to start. We need to get some definitions hammered out that will help us, hopefully help us understand kind of the world that we live in as medical cannabis patients. Is that a right? Is it a privilege? Does it come with duties? So we'll go through some of those concepts. And then we're going to talk about 5 main themes, I guess. We're going to talk about driving and being a safe driver when you're a patient. We're going to talk about housing and what your patient status might mean for that, especially if you are renting. We're going to talk about parenting, because there are some special things to consider if you are a medical marijuana patient who is a parent. We're going to talk about gun ownership. Been a lot of talk about that here in Maine over the last couple of months, and there's, again, another layer to that conversation once you add in the fact that you are a medical marijuana patient. And then finally, we'll talk about employment and what kind of protections, if any, there are for medical marijuana patients who are employed. Okay? So let's just get right to it here. Rights, privileges, and duties. So when we talk about rights, you might hear people say, well, I have a right to use this plant as medicine, all right? There are 2 types of rights. So a natural right, when we talk about, I am inherently given a right by the virtue of the fact that I am a human being to use this plant, that's actually a political theory. And that theory says that every human is possessed of certain inalienable rights, okay, rights that cannot be infringed upon. And that these rights don't come from any government. They don't come from the fact that I, am a good citizen. They come from the fact that I'm a human being, right? And no government or individual can deny me these rights. And in the U.S., we define these rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's pretty familiar to some of us, many of us. But nowhere in the United States Constitution or any of the amendments is there a defined right. When we talk about natural rights, the right to use a plant might seem very logical to us. It might seem very natural to us, but it is not typically, so far, considered to be a natural right. In terms of civil or legal rights, now that's another level here. Okay, so a civil or a legal right is a right that belongs to every citizen who lives in a certain jurisdiction or state, right? And these are codified by governments, and government is basically just a lot of people getting together and working together. So civil or legal rights are man-made, right? As opposed to being inherent in us by virtue of the fact that we are humans, man makes civil or legal rights. And because we have courts and governmental systems, if somebody steps on our civil or legal rights, we can take them to court. We can sue them, right? And so we have an opportunity for redress. So in the U.S., we have a civil or legal right to a trial by jury. We have a civil right to equal protection under the law. You might have heard of your Miranda rights. If you get arrested, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, correct? You have the right to an attorney. So these are rights that we have all decided that, you know, it's a good idea if every human being, every citizen has access to those rights. And civil or legal rights changed over time. Okay, case in point, the Civil Rights Act back in the 60s. We as citizens get together and we change our minds about what kind of rights various groups of people should have. We just saw that happen with marriage. State by state, same-sex marriage was, you know, becoming added into the list of rights that humans had, and finally the federal government said, okay, marriage is for all. It's for different sex and same-sex couples. So civil or legal rights shift over time. I can tell you, unfortunately, while, you know, cannabis may be a natural right. It's a plant. We're humans. You know, we're put on this earth, some people believe, to tend it and to be good stewards of the earth, and part of that is to care for this plant. I don't know of any court cases yet that have successfully held up cannabis as a natural right for us. There's one court case that you can look up if you're taking notes. Actually, it might be a good idea if you don't have pen and paper with you to maybe grab some. There's a court case that happened back in the 90s, early 2000s, out in California. A woman named Angel Raich, R-A-I-C-H, Angel Raich, very sick with a number of different ailments, and she sued our government to, and her case said, I have a right to life, right? I have a natural right to life, and part of that is to be able to use my medicine. And unfortunately, she battled that all the way up, you know, through the courts. And unfortunately, the courts at that time said, no, medical cannabis is not a natural right. So I don't know of any court cases yet where that has been proven. However, we do see that medical marijuana use is becoming, in many more jurisdictions all the time, a civil right, a legal right, that there are, you know, it's granted to us by our government, and there are protections for patients. Because it's still fairly new, and you have to think, I mean, even, you know, California was, you know, if you could call California in 1996 the first medical marijuana state. The whole state passed a law that said, you know, we're gonna allow this use explicitly. And so that's fairly recent in terms of legalities. Okay, 96 is the blink of an eye when we look back at the whole history of legal rights for humans. And so it's changing, it's evolving, and I would imagine that within the next 5 or 10 years we're going to see medical use and probably adult use of cannabis become a legal right that is extended to more and more citizens in the United States, not just state by state, but eventually at a federal level. So we have these rights, and then there are privileges, right? So a privilege is a special benefit. And often it takes the form of some kind of an exemption from a duty that other citizens have to perform. Sometimes it takes the form of a perk that other citizens don't get. But as you see here, so you are medical cannabis patients in good standing in the state of Maine. That is a civil or a legal right that you have, that the citizens of this state have granted you. What that comes with, you know, that confers a privilege on you. It confers a couple of privileges on you. One of them being you get to legally possess more cannabis than a non-patient. Technically, in most of the state of Maine, somebody who does not have a medical marijuana card can't legally possess any marijuana. And so your status, your civil right as a medical cannabis patient, confers the privilege on you of being able to possess and consume cannabis in a way that non-patients don't have access to. And with that come responsibilities and duties. And so a responsibility is, there are legal definitions here. It's an obligation that entails mandatory conduct or performance. So one example of this, you have, the privilege of being a citizen of the United States, and that comes with the responsibility to, say, serve jury duty, right? So responsibilities aren't always fun, but they're sort of a toll, if you will, for living in a civilized society and having some of the privileges that we have. And so you see, the logical flow here. I'm a medical patient in good standing. That is my legal right here in the state of Maine. I can legally possess more cannabis than non-patients can here in the state of Maine. That's a privilege. However, that privilege comes with a responsibility to use it safely. And so, for example, I can't drive to endanger. I can't legally, and some might say morally, get in my car having just done, 4 dabs and put a child in the back seat and go tearing down the highway. Although maybe you wouldn't be tearing down the highway. You might be going very slow, but it wouldn't be safe. And so you have a responsibility to the other citizens who are in your community to behave responsibly. And so when we're talking about all of these legal concepts that we're going to get into next, keep these in the back of your mind, right? So just because you are a medical marijuana patient, that does confer, you do have that legal right. Because things are still in flux, because the laws are still changing, that right to be and use, to be a patient and use medical marijuana is also in flux. It's not ironclad, and there are privileges certainly that patients have, but there are also responsibilities, and there are a lot, as you'll find out. There are a lot of gray areas, where it's going to depend on who is interpreting the rights, who's interpreting the rules, and that will determine how far those rights stretch, how far those privileges go, and what kind of responsibilities that we're held to. Are there any questions so far? Are we doing good, Ben? I wish you guys could see us. We're sitting here in Gardner, and Ben's got his headphones on. It looks all very, very professional. Awesome. All right, so medical marijuana, the square peg, we keep trying to bang it into these we've got these frameworks, we've got the natural rights, and as I said, some folks consider the use of cannabis a natural right. Unfortunately, the courts haven't agreed so far. It is definitely a civil right. It's a legal right in many places to use medical cannabis, and very recently it's become a legal right to use recreational cannabis in 4 states. Right? There are privileges that are conferred upon medical cannabis users in states that allow it, and there are always responsibilities that come along with these privileges and rights. And these responsibilities are a lot of what we're going to spend time talking about today. So, absence of clear state guidelines, certainly no clear federal guidelines. They're still not sure if it's worse than heroin. They don't think we should have it. It's a Schedule I drug. So not a lot of clarity, all right? And then we have, we're still coming out of 80 plus years of prohibition against this plant, and there's a lot of stigma that attaches to that. So even though we have rights as medical marijuana patients, there are folks who don't think that we should. There are folks who think that we're still criminals because we choose to use this plant. And therefore, given that sort of background situation, it's in everybody's best interest, certainly the medical cannabis community's best interest, for us to always hold ourselves to the highest standard of conduct that we possibly can. And we owe that to ourselves, we owe it to our families, we owe it to our local communities, and we also owe it to our national community. And when I put that in there, I was thinking of the national medical marijuana community, but as a nation, even people who choose not to use this stuff look at the folks who do. And so we have a responsibility, a duty, if you will, to be good ambassadors for this plant that is so helpful to us, and to help folks get past that stigma that unfortunately still attaches to cannabis and to the people who choose to use it and grow it. So by being the best that we can be, we set a good example. We create a narrative that is positive instead of all of the negative stereotypes that have been thrown at us. So driving. Well, I've given you one example of what not to do. But there will come times when you need to drive your vehicle and have your medicine with you. And there are ways to do this in a safer manner than some other ways. So number one, you see right there, that trunk is open. That is the safest space to store your medicine when you're taking it from your source to your home. And technically, one of the responsibilities that comes along with being a medical marijuana patient and vendor in Maine is that you should be receiving a triptych or a receipt every time you purchase your medical marijuana. And under state regulations, that triptych is required to have some identifying information that would tell law enforcement where that medicine is going and who it belongs to. So at WCM, we do that with code numbers, with serial numbers. Other people might do it slightly differently, but you should always keep that with the medicine, in the bag with your medicine. And keep it in the trunk. If your trunk is full, if your trunk no longer opens because you have a fender bender, put it in the glove box, put it under the back seat. You want it to be as far away from you as possible. Because in the event that you get pulled over, even though you are a medical marijuana patient and you've got your identification card on you, the laws are still in flux. And again, there are plenty of folks who don't think that this program is valid, and you might end up with a law enforcement officer who believes that way. And if they choose to, they can basically ignore your patient identification card. If you don't have it on you and you say, well, I'm a patient, they don't have to believe that. And anything that is within arm's reach in the car, so anything on the passenger seat, anything on the passenger floorboard, in the console, they can charge you with that. And this is important too, just from a general keeping your ducks in a row standpoint. If you have people who travel in your car, if you give rides to friends and stuff, you want to be sure that they're not bringing contraband, and I'm not talking about cannabis, but other contraband into your vehicle where it might drop out, and you might end up with something under the passenger seat or in the console that you legitimately did not know about, but that an officer can charge you with because it was within arm's reach of you in the vehicle. And they can say, well, that was your baggie of whatever, and then you have a problem on your hands. So you want to keep all of your medical marijuana in the trunk or in the glove box. You don't want to drive and have somebody rolling a cigarette in the passenger seat. And not that you don't have a right to use cannabis responsibly, and not that having a passenger roll you some medicine up is technically illegal, but it can complicate things, and you want to keep things simple if you get pulled over, right? You definitely want to use the odor blocking storage solutions if possible. There's some kind of an ongoing legal struggle about whether the smell of cannabis alone is probable cause to search a car. And different courts in different jurisdictions are ruling different ways on that. So until we get that sorted out, best to do your darndest to control any sort of odor that might be in your vehicle. Know too that anything that is visible, when we've probably all been pulled over, and we know that there's that horrible moment where you're sitting there, and number one, you're embarrassed, and number two, you're kind of scared because you don't know what's happening, and the cop walks up alongside, and he's not just walking up to, say hello. When he's walking up, he's looking in your vehicle. He's looking in the back seat before he gets to your driver's window. And so if there is something visible as he's doing that glancing around thing that they're trained to do, that can become probable cause for a search. If you have a pipe, if you have half of a joint in the driver's side, the little armrest on the door, anything that they can see that gives them probable cause to search, they will take advantage of that. So it's in your best interest, even though you have an absolute right to be a patient and to travel with your medicine, it is in your best interest to do this discreetly and in a way that doesn't invite or encourage any sort of law enforcement interaction. Now, if you are driving a vehicle with cannabis in you, your certification does not provide protection from our OUI standards. Okay, so your rights as a medical marijuana patient do not trump the rest of society's rights to be safe on the roads. Okay. Now, currently, there is no impairment test for cannabis the way there is for alcohol, right? I'm sure that eventually we will get to that point. I'm sure that many very smart people are working on that as we speak. But at present, they don't have a reliable way to test you. And so what they will do, if they see that your eyes are bloodshot and you have half of a cannabis cigarette in your console, they'll pull you out and give you a field sobriety test. So that's walk heel to toe. That might be saying the alphabet backwards, following the pen or the finger with your eyes. What they're doing there is they're looking for probable cause to search more, to find any sort of contraband that you might have, etc. So, as a patient, most of us are probably, if you're using cannabis every day, whether you don't have to have just taken a sip from your vaporizer and got behind the wheel to have cannabis in your system. Most of us are well able to function even though we have high levels of cannabis metabolites in our systems. So, a field sobriety test should not be a problem. However, if you are impaired, if you're driving excessively slowly, if you're weaving in your lanes, and they pull you out and give you a field sobriety test, if they have a strong enough suspicion, they can do a blood test on you, right? And even though this is not technically infallible, even though regular users of cannabis are going to have higher levels of the metabolites in our blood, and we might not be impaired, it's the best they can do. And so that's what they're doing now. You don't have to consent to that search. That might make it a little more difficult. It might take, if they really want to do a test, they will find a way. So basically, the safest thing to do is, know your limits. Don't drive shortly after consuming. If you've used an edible and it's a new product for you and you don't know how it's going to affect you, do not get behind the wheel. Don't do those things that will put yourself that could put you in a bad situation. And again, this is not because you don't have rights as a medical marijuana patient. It is because, in the eyes of our government, your rights as a patient do not trump everyone else's right to be safe on the roads. Do we have any questions about driving at this point? All right, great. Just know that it's very simple to avoid an unwanted law enforcement interaction. Oh, and another thing, I'm sorry I skipped over this a little bit, but make sure every once in a while go out and do a walk around of your vehicle. Turn the lights on and make sure that both of your headlights work and your tail lights and brake lights work. Have somebody go out with you and check, because a lot of problems with cannabis users and law enforcement don't start because the officer sees somebody smoking a pipe in their car. They start because somebody has a broken taillight or their headlights don't work, and they get pulled over for that. And the officer comes up and they glance in the car, or the window comes down a little bit and they smell something, and from there those little tiny things can escalate. And so it's in your best interest as a patient to, you know, it's in your best interest to keep things on the up and up. It will make your life much easier. So let's talk about housing. If you own your own home and you're a good neighbor, and you know maybe you're growing outside, but you're taking measures to keep the odor away from your neighbors, you're probably in good shape. But many of us rent. Some of us rent to other people. And here is another place where, in general, the courts have decided that the medical patient's rights do not trump the owner's, you know, the property owner's property rights. Okay, so landlords can make their own decisions. If you're renting an apartment and they allow smoking tobacco on the porch, that does not necessarily mean that they will allow smoking cannabis on the porch. And if you challenge that and they evict you and you take them to court, it's likely that the courts are going to side with the landlord, right? This is a great place to plug vaporizing because it is much more discreet, but not everybody likes that. So just be aware, and you know, it doesn't hurt to be clear with your landlord about what their expectations are. Same thing with growing. In fact, I have never heard of a landlord who is renting an apartment who let's say is not offended at the thought of somebody, you know, converting a closet into a grow space. Actually, that's not true. I do know a couple who are okay with it. But in general, that's not what landlords expect from their tenants, and it's not what courts are upholding when these cases do go to civil courts. There is no federal right that is going to protect you in this case. Similarly, there is no federal right that protects medical marijuana patients in terms of subsidized housing. And a couple of years ago here in Maine, we saw this happen where you know, the organization that oversees housing in the state was looking at, you know, gosh, there are people who are living in these homes who want to use or grow cannabis. There are people applying for these homes who want to use or grow cannabis. And what do we do? And what they decided was to grandfather in anybody who was currently residing in these homes, whether, you know, if they were a medical marijuana patient. But they did, unfortunately, allow the agencies to reject applicants for subsidized housing if they admitted to being medical marijuana patients. And this has not gone up to, as far as I know, this has not gone to the Maine Supreme Court yet. I don't know that anybody has taken a case that far. But right now, if you are applying for federally subsidized housing and you admit to being a medical marijuana patient, not even that you're going to use or that you're going to grow, you admit to being a medical marijuana patient, they can use that to deny your application. So here's another case where your medical cannabis rights, you know, at least this one governing body have decided that you know, they do not trump the right of the landlord to control their property, the right of the housing administrators not to lose federal funding, which is, you know, the excuse that they used. They were afraid that the feds would yank funding from these housing projects, and so that's where that decision is, you know, stands right now. So I mentioned, you know, keeping your taillights and your headlights in order and making sure your blinkers work on your car. The same thing if you are a renter, and actually even if you own your own home, if you have neighbors within hearing distance. A large majority of at-home law enforcement interactions that go bad, you know, the cop comes in and finds the plants or busts people for smoking, most of those come from neighbor complaints, right? Somebody's having a huge party. There's domestic violence, they hear shouting, and so they call the police. And in the course of their inspection, law enforcement finds, a bong on the table or the plants in the closet. So just another place where it is in your best interest to be a responsible neighbor, a responsible patient, and not draw that kind of attention to yourself, because that is extremely unfortunate. So when that happens, how are we doing on this? Any questions so far? Well, many of us are parents. Some of us are parents of patients. And here is another area where our rights as patients and our rights as parents and our responsibilities as parents can come into conflict. So some things to consider, right? No matter how old your child is, I would say up to 21, you always want to store this stuff in a child-proof safe or locked away somewhere, someplace that the child can't get into. And we would recommend not using it in the presence of your under 21 children. Not because you don't have the right to do that, not because we think that the plant is something shameful that you should hide away, but because your children can inadvertently say things that bring unwanted law enforcement attention, right? There's a case out in Kansas, a woman, again, if you've got your pens out, a woman whose name is Shona Banda, S-H-O-N-A, B-A, B as in N-D-A. And just recently, Shona's son was at school and they were having a DARE presentation, and he made some comments about her use of medical marijuana and that there was marijuana in the home. And he was questioned more extensively by school authorities and then by police. And he was removed from her custody, and she is now facing serious charges. Now, again, this was in Kansas, where there is no legal medical right to use marijuana, but that is a story that could and has happened elsewhere as well. So, talk in age-appropriate ways with your children, but when it comes to storage and usage, it is probably safest to do that in a private way, and to be very clear that this is, daddy's medicine, this is mommy's medicine, this is not for kids. And as they get older, certainly those conversations can expand. All right. Unfortunately, the fuzzy edges of the medical marijuana's legality and the rights that it confers to you do not trump parenting rights and sort of the expectations that our society has of parents. So. And here's another concern, and something that we have seen happen, and it's very unfortunate. But cannabis use in the home, medical and or adult social use, is grounds for CPS to get involved. And in custody disputes, or we have heard from patients who, unfortunately their relationship is going wrong, and one or other of them has been growing or using medical marijuana, and the disgruntled other partner reports that, to CPS as, no matter how innocent, no matter how, good the patient has been about storage and not using in front of the kids, a disgruntled ex can use that in a malicious way. And we never want to think that somebody we love or have loved is going to do that, but it can happen. Now, part of your rights under Maine's law as a medical patient is that you can't be denied parental rights and responsibilities or contact with your minor child as long as you're acting within the guidelines set out by the Maine medical marijuana law. But look at that last line, unless the person's conduct is contrary to the best interests of the child. And we just saw a case right here in Maine that went up to our Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, where the parents had split up, and the one partner was not being responsible, let's put it that way, about storage, about not using in front of the children. The other partner claimed that sometimes she would pick the kids up and the children would smell like marijuana. And it was, she brought that to bear in the custody hearing. She did not want to share custody with him anymore. She said she was worried about the safety of the children. And he fought that, and again, it went right up to the Supreme Court, and earlier this year, the justices decided to award her sole custody, right? And it wasn't because he's a medical marijuana patient. They were very clear about that. His rights as a medical marijuana patient were not the issue. The issue was that last line. His conduct was contrary to the best interests of the child, and the justices felt that it had been proved that the children were negatively impacted, and so he did lose custody. And again, I know we don't ever want to think that that's going to happen, especially not when a relationship is going well. But it is something that does happen, and it's something to be conscious of, and just another good reason to be a responsible role model as a patient. Okay. So just remember, your duties as a parent always come first. The courts are going to uphold that. Your neighbors are going to expect that. You should expect it as of yourself. And creating a track record and being a responsible, safe, consumer and storer of this product is definitely the safest. The safest for you, the safest for your kids, right? Any questions on the parenting section? We good? Ben says we're good. All right. Patients who own guns. Goodness gracious. Here's another spot where okay, we've got, a fully enshrined Second Amendment right to bear arms and a more recently enshrined state right to consume medical marijuana. And because, I can tell you, because the Second Amendment is a federally agreed upon document, that does tend to trump the state law, right? Now, does that mean that if you're a medical marijuana patient, you cannot own a gun, or you have to give up the guns that you already own once you get your certification? No, it does not. But the same, be smart. Be smart about this. If you are storing your guns in your home, do not keep your medicine in that gun safe there on the left, right? If there are guns in there, put the cannabis elsewhere, okay? In the car, if you keep a gun in your glove box, put the cannabis in your trunk, okay? Keep them as far apart as possible. And the reason for this is, as we know, the federal government thinks that this is a Schedule I drug. It's very dangerous. It's easily abused. It has no medical use. And so the penalties for people who use it, the federal penalties, are extreme. And especially for people who have quantities of it or people who are growing it, right? They really come down on you. And do not think that you can't be busted by a federal officer here in Maine. We have Border Patrol here in Maine. We have a federal park here in Maine. And so if you encounter a federal agent, if they pull you over with your medicine, your patient certification is not going to help you. It's worth the paper that it's written on in the federal government's eyes at this point. And back in the good old 80s and 90s, one thing, I think a lot of folks might remember Bill Clinton fondly. I don't know, but one of the things that he did that he doesn't often get I think a lot of people forget. He really ratcheted up the 3 strikes you're out laws, and went a long way towards filling our prisons with nonviolent drug offenders that way. And he also carried on Reagan's tradition of imposing significant mandatory minimums for drug crimes. And now a mandatory minimum, and again, this is federal, this is not state, this is a federal consideration only. A mandatory minimum is something, it's pretty insidious. Basically, you are charged with a crime. Let's say you're charged with growing up to 100 cannabis plants in your back 40, right? And federal agents find that. Depending on your prior history and depending on, how cooperative you are, you can be charged with a federal crime that would get you a mandatory minimum of 10 years, I believe, in prison, right? And that means the judge has no leeway. The judge cannot say, Ben, you've already been in jail waiting for your trial for 18 months, so we'll knock that off your sentence. The judge can't say, Sharon, you're a fantastic mom and you've got small kids at home, and so we'll cut this sentence down, to 2 years or probation. The judge in a mandatory minimum case has no leeway. Another piece of this puzzle is that if you have cannabis and a gun, those mandatory minimums can double, right? And so 5 years becomes 10, 10 years becomes 20, simply for having a gun, present in the same space as the cannabis. Again, this is at the federal level only. I don't think any Maine state law enforcement officer is interested in pursuing this, but it is something to be aware of, and it's very, very serious. And so this is why I'm saying, if you have guns, that's fantastic. Keep them separate. Keep them as far away from your medicine as you possibly can. And eventually, the federal government will come around and will fix and sort of undo some of these damaging policies. But until that happens, it's simply not worth taking the risk. So, again, your duties as a responsible citizen, your duties to be safe, however we define that, but the government defines that, comes first. Okay? Keep them apart. And there are no special exemptions. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, if you go to purchase a new gun, they're going to ask you if you use Schedule I substances, right? And there is no good answer that I can give you for how to answer that. I'm not going to tell you to lie, but I do know that if you are honest about that, they can refuse to issue a permit. So this is a situation, if you're interested in purchasing a new firearm, here is a situation where I would strongly encourage you to contact a lawyer. Call Pine Tree Legal. Call somebody who is qualified and ask them for some advice on that, right? And again, if you have your certification and you have already you are already a gun owner, be safe. Be thoughtful about storage and usage. All righty, so we're on to patients in the workplace. This is interesting. Our own Department of Labor is doing some groups meeting over the summer to determine, does Maine need a new policy? Should there be recommendations for employers in terms of how to handle an employee who is using medical marijuana? For those of us who are familiar with the product and its medicinal use, we know that medical patients typically are wanting to feel good enough to work. They're not trying to use in a way that is, recreational or that makes them unfunctional. They want to get back to being functional. But here is a place where we're running up against all of those years of stigma and stereotyping again. And unfortunately, here in Maine and around the states, when these issues have gone before Supreme Courts, state Supreme Courts, they have consistently been siding with the employer. And so here's a case that you can look up. Brandon Coates was hired by Dish Network. He was honest. He told them, I'm a medical marijuana patient, and when you drug test me, I will test positive for cannabis. And somebody at the company said, oh, that's fine. And so he went through the onboarding process and started work. And as soon as his drug test came back positive for cannabis metabolites, Dish Network said, sorry, you're out of here. We can't employ you after all. And he fought that battle. He's been fighting that. I think that happened, gosh, almost five or 6 years ago now. And he has been fighting and fighting. And finally, this year, the Colorado State Supreme Court ruled in favor of the employer. They said Dish Network had every right to terminate his employment simply because he tested positive for marijuana, because that was their policy. It didn't matter whether he was a legal patient in Colorado or not. And we see that happening, again, around the states. There have been a couple of instances where that has happened here in Maine. A temp agency worker for Adecco was released because she tested positive, even though she is a qualified patient. So here in Maine, there was a woman who was hired by the temp agency Adecco and then let go, again, because she's a medical marijuana patient. And last I heard, that had not been decided, but I may have to look that up, or you can Google that. It's Adecco, Adecco, medical marijuana employment case. There's a current case down in Boston. It pops up around the nation in these medical marijuana states, and so far, again, the courts seem to be deciding that the rights of the employer trump the rights of the medical marijuana user. There have been some really promising developments in New Mexico, where workers' comp has been covering medical marijuana for patients who were injured on the job. And there have been, I think, 3 cases out there where the employers or the workers' comp companies have fought those cases, taken them all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and the courts keep ruling in favor of having workers' comp cover the cost of medical marijuana for these patients. So this is another area where we're going to see these laws change. In another 5 or 10 years, we're going to see these laws, shifting. I think simply because more and more people will be using this, and employers are going to be hard pressed to find good employees who do not or have not used marijuana for medicinal or recreational purposes. Notice, employers can disqualify you. They are also free to set their own internal policies. For example, Wellness Connection does this. Certainly, we hire patients. We want employees who understand the medicine and can help people navigate the system. And so, but yet we are also required by state law to do pre-employment drug testing, right? And so what we do is we tell the drug testing company, hey, this person, Ben is applying. Ben is a qualified medical marijuana patient. Here's a copy of his card. His test is going to come back positive for cannabis. We still want to hire him. And we have to sign one extra piece of paper, and that is all it takes. So employers are perfectly free to do that. Some of them might not know that they have that option. Some of them might know and just choose not to because they are still fearful or they carry those stigmas. But it is possible for them to do that. Okay, and if you're looking, if you find a job that you are interested in applying for, you can call their HR manager and ask what their policy is. You don't have to reveal, yourself. I know some people feel like if they ask the question that is going to be held against them. So you can call anonymously. You could have a friend call. But ask them what their policy is. And I think, we've been attending these meetings at the Department of Labor, and I think that employers just don't understand the reality of life for medical patients. I think they sort of paint every cannabis user with the Cheech and Chong mentality, and that is very unfortunate. And it can't change fast enough. But the more this issue bubbles up, and the more they see that they are missing out on well-qualified candidates by implementing these policies, the sooner it will change as well. It is my understanding that Bath Iron Works is is maybe not encouraging, but is at least open to having workers who are injured on the job when they go out on workers' comp claims, having them use medical cannabis because they don't want them using the opioids because that's such a huge problem in Maine. So, I mean, if a company, like Bath Iron Works that has, probably the majority of their work is federal contracts, if they're heading in that direction, I take that as a very, very positive sign. All right, we're going to wrap things up here. Before we go, I want you to know that this this training would have been very different just a few years ago. When I was working in California, we would do Know Your Rights trainings, and it was all about how to handle a law enforcement raid, a federal raid. And so we are fortunate to live here in Maine. We are fortunate to be in a state that, I didn't mean to do that. We are fortunate to be in a state that has stringent regulations, but that does provide us with the rights that we have, and where the legislators are open to this concept and flexible enough to continue to change and improve the law, right? That doesn't mean that negative interactions won't happen. As I said, you can get pulled over for a broken tail light and have a bag on your passenger seat, and the officer says, "What's in the bag?" And you say, "Well, that's my medical marijuana," and you don't have your certification with you, and things go south from there. Do remember that even though state law enforcement is pretty understanding for the most part about medical marijuana patients, and they're respectful of it, if you do have a negative law enforcement encounter, it's going to go through 3 phases, right? So the first phase is sort of stop and chat, right? This is, it doesn't typically apply in a car. Typically, this is, if you're in a park or something, striking up a conversation. You have to remember that there is no good reason for law enforcement to be engaging with you if you are not actively, breaking into a building or something, other than to find information. They might think that you look like somebody else, or that you fit the description of somebody who vandalized a building or something. But there's really never a positive reason for law enforcement to initiate an encounter with you. Okay, so stop and talk. That's fine. If as soon as you can comfortably do it, you should say, "Hey, I need to go. I'm late to pick up my grandma. I got to run to the store. I need to go. Thank you, officer. Have a good day." They might try and keep chatting with you, and you keep walking. Say, "Am I okay to go?" And keep walking. And the only reason you stop walking is if they say, "No, you are not free to go." And that means that we have moved from the first to the second stage of a law enforcement encounter. And the second stage is detention, right? And that is when you are not free to walk away from the interaction. Probably the example of detention that everybody is most familiar with is when you get pulled over on the side of the road, right? You're being detained. There's no casual conversation happening. If you pull away, you're going to be chased down. So you're being detained. And at that point, the next step is arrest. So if you find yourself being detained, it is best to be prepared, right? Again, am I under arrest? Am I free to go? If you can, then walk away. If you can't, if it's a typical roadside traffic stop, give them your ID, give them your registration, the documents that you have to show, but you don't have to answer any questions. You don't have to tell them where you're going. And it's difficult not to do that. It's difficult because we're trained to respect the uniform and we're trained to respect the officer. But just remember that all of that is fishing, right? It's none of his business where you're going or where you're coming from. And so an appropriate response to that kind of question would simply be, "I'm really in a hurry, officer. Can we get this over with?" Right? If they are pulling you out of the car, if they're asking to look through the car, the You know, I have friends who have tried to talk their way out of that with varying levels of success. But really, if it looks like you are being detained and it's heading towards an arrest, the only safe thing for you to say is, I choose to remain silent. I want to see a lawyer. Okay? So, you know, it seems extreme, and again, we all want to be friendly with the cops and kind of shine them on, and we respect them and whatever, but it's certainly if you have been pulled out of a car, certainly if they're asking to search your vehicle, you know, your afternoon is going to be shot anyway. And really the only safe thing to say in some of those situations is, I choose to remain silent, I want to see a lawyer, and I do not consent to a search. Right? Once you have invoked those rights, and again, this goes right back to this is a federal constitutional right. You have a right not to incriminate yourself. And so once you invoke those rights, the next thing to remember is to stay silent and not chat with the officers, right? The only thing you might want to say is, you know, when can I call my lawyer? You don't need to be answering questions or anything like that. And I certainly hope that, you know, we're at a point in our society where, you know, simple possession of cannabis no longer, you know, creates these sorts of situations. But, you know, life is funny, and we might find ourselves at a party that gets busted, or we might find ourselves, you know, as a passenger in a car that, you know, who knows what the driver might have in the glove box. It is, again, the safest thing. If you are facing arrest, if you are facing a physical or a vehicle search, the safest thing to say is, I choose to remain silent, I want to see a lawyer, and I do not consent to a search. Okay? I hope you never have to use those words, but if you do, keep them in mind. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Are there any questions about what we have covered? Oh, look at you. And of course, you can always email info@mainewellness.org if you have questions that you don't want to share with the whole group. That's perfectly fine. And at this point, I think we're gonna get ready to sign off. Are we good, Ben? Ben says we're good. So I think we're gonna call it a day. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and a lovely weekend. Let's hope this heat breaks pretty soon. And be safe out there, folks. Thank you so much for being with us.